Imagine a name that has spanned centuries, always carrying the same weight of repulsion, fear, and warning. A name that wasn't confined to the pages of the Bible, but came to symbolize all that is darkest when it comes to manipulation, idolatry, and defiance of divine authority. That name is Jezebel. Even those who have never opened the scriptures have, at some point, heard the word used as a synonym for cruelty, deceptive seduction, or corrupt power. But who was this woman really? How did someone born surrounded by wealth, luxury, and influence become the epitome of spiritual corruption and political arrogance? Jezebel was not just a figure from the past, but a living reminder, an eternal icon of the struggle between human power and divine justice. Her story does not begin on the throne of Israel, but much earlier, in a rich and feared land, Sidon, in the heart of Phoenicia. There, among stone temples built by the sea and palaces decorated with ivory, a princess was born who would be unlike any other. Unlike so many young women of ancient nobility, Jezebel did not grow up surrounded by servants and banquets. She was shaped from an early age in an environment of dark religiosity and absolute political power. Her father, Ethbaal, was not only the king of the region, he was also the high priest of Baal, the most feared and revered deity of the time. For the Phoenicians, Baal was the lord of storms, fertility, and prosperity. He was the god who brought rain for the harvests and also demanded terrible sacrifices. Jezebel grew up, therefore, breathing incense before altars, watching rituals, listening to chants, and learning that power came not only from the throne, but also from the blood shed in the name of the gods. It was in this context that her personality began to be forged. While many princesses were trained only to embroider or wait for an arranged marriage, Jezebel learned something very different: how to manipulate, how to rule, how to subjugate. From an early age, she observed the political games of the court, the deals sealed at banquets, the calculated glances of foreign merchants who came to trade in the port of Phoenicia. More than that, she learned to identify body and soul with Baal. For her, that god was not just a belief, he was identity, purpose, and destiny, and it was precisely this relentless devotion that she would take with her when she left Sidon. Her marriage to King Ahab of Israel was not driven by love or desire, but by politics. A strategic alliance between two powerful kingdoms, Sidon, a maritime trading center, and Israel, a land of agricultural roots and geopolitical importance. Upon setting foot in Samaria, Jezebel saw herself not simply as queen of a foreign people, but as a messenger of her faith, a spokesperson for her gods, and the architect of a new order. And here lies the key to understanding why Jezebel is still remembered with such weight today. She wasn't content to simply practice her religion in private. She didn't accept living discreetly as queen, respecting the faith of the people of Israel. Jezebel had another ambition: to convert an entire nation to the worship of Baal. Her name became, from the beginning, an open challenge to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, when we speak of Jezebel, we speak not only of a woman, but of a spirit of rebellion that spans the ages. She is remembered as the one who used charm, cunning, and cruelty to impose her will. A woman whose presence made kings tremble, prophets hide, and entire peoples bow. Jezebel is the portrait of an authority that seemed indestructible, but who, deep down, was heading toward a fate written with implacable force. You'll realize this story isn't just about the past. It's about how choices shaped by pride and idolatry can transform even an untouchable queen into the eternal symbol of the most humiliating downfall ever recorded. Jezebel begins as a princess in a land of luxury, but ends as an example of what happens when someone believes they can defy not just men, but God himself. Now that you understand how Jezebel became more than a queen, but an icon of rebellion against God himself, it's time for you to join this investigation too. Like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything to come. And stay glued to the screen, because at the end of this video, I'll reveal a hidden detail, a dark enigma about Jezebel that still intrigues archaeologists and scholars today, and could completely change the way you view her story. To understand Jezebel in all her complexity, we must return to the golden walls of Sidon, her homeland. Imagine a vibrant port city where ships from Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia docked daily, bringing perfumes, fabrics, precious stones, and spices. Sidon was the heart of Phoenicia, a civilization whose strength came not from giant armies, but from something even more powerful: trade and religion. It was a city that knew how to negotiate, but also knew how to dominate through faith. It was into this setting that Jezebel was born, not only as a princess, daughter of King Ethbaal, but as heir to a dual lineage, political and spiritual. Ethbaal was no ordinary ruler. He carried a scepter and a censer in his hands. He was king before men and high priest of Baal before the gods. This meant that Jezebel grew up within palaces decorated with ivory, but also within temples filled with offerings, sacrifices, and songs that echoed into the night. For her, the throne and the altar were inseparable. Political power was meaningless without spiritual power, and the worship of Baal was not just devotion, but also an instrument of government. From a young age, Jezebel learned that religion could subjugate peoples, that gods could become political weapons, and that authority was something to be imposed, not negotiated. Imagine little Jezebel, still a child, walking through the halls of Baal's temple in Sidon. Tall columns, blazing fire on black stone altars, priests dressed in red robes, and trance-like dancers calling for storms and fertility. The smell of burning flesh mixed with incense created a dense, suffocating atmosphere, but for her, it was the natural air of life. While other children learned innocent songs, Jezebel grew up listening to sacrificial chants. While other girls dreamed of marriage, Jezebel learned to control people through faith. This environment shaped a woman who knew no limits. Jezebel learned early on that she could use her position to achieve whatever she wanted. Her beauty wasn't just a physical attribute, it was a tool of influence. Her voice wasn't just sweet, it was charged with persuasion. Her gaze wasn't just attractive, it was calculated, like someone who always saw the next move on the political stage. And it was with these weapons that she became a key player in one of the most controversial political marriages of antiquity. Jezebel was promised to King Ahab, ruler of Israel. For diplomats, it was a strategic alliance. Uniting the interests of Phoenicia and Israel would create a powerful trade network and guarantee protection against common enemies. But for Jezebel, this marriage meant something much greater: the chance to expand Baal's dominion beyond Sidon to the heart of the people who served the God of Abraham. When Jezebel left Sidon for Israel, she didn't just take jewelry, fine fabrics, and perfumes. She also took with her priests, altars, images, and rituals. She wasn't a princess abandoning her homeland, but a missionary determined to plant the cult of Baal in foreign territory. Jezebel didn't simply want to live in Israel, she wanted to transform Israel into an extension of Phoenicia, and that's what made her so feared. Jezebel refused to accept the coexistence of gods. For her, either Baal reigned or no one reigned. This relentless intolerance would make her not only queen, but the greatest enemy of the Lord's prophets. Jezebel's fate, therefore, was already written in the halls of Sidon. It was not in Israel that she became Jezebel, it was in Sidon, while still a daughter of Ethbaal, that her mind was shaped to believe she could defy any spiritual order, including that of the God of Israel himself. The story of her rise begins with the union of two crowns in her family, the crown of the king and the crown of the priest. Jezebel was not merely heir to a throne, she was heir to a vision, that of a world controlled by the worship of Baal. Jezebel's marriage to King Ahab was not a union of love, but of vested interests. It was politics in its purest and rawest form. Sidon, the powerful Phoenician city, needed allies to expand its maritime trade and secure protection against rival powers. Israel, for its part, sought to strengthen itself in the face of growing threats from Syria and other neighboring kingdoms. The alliance seemed perfect, wealth on one side, strategic territory on the other, but behind the diplomacy, Jezebel saw something even greater. For her, this marriage was no mere political treaty. It was a golden opportunity to export her faith, expand Baal's power, and ultimately challenge the God of Israel. Imagine the scene: Jezebel crossing the roads towards Samaria, the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. Her entourage carried not only chests of gold, luxurious fabrics, and servants. Among the wagons were also images of Baal, censers, ritually trained priests, and even consecrated stones for erecting altars. It was as if Jezebel had brought all of Sidon with her, ready to be planted on foreign soil. On the other hand, Ahab, though king, was a weak-willed, indecisive man, always seeking approval. He not only welcomed her as his wife, but as the lady of the palace. Jezebel quickly realized her advantage. All she had to do was whisper, and Ahab would yield. All she had to do was look firmly, and he would accept. All she had to do was give a veiled command, and it became law. And Jezebel wasted no time. She installed in Israel not only the physical presence of Baal, but also his ideology. She ordered the construction of grand temples in the heart of the capital, smoking altars that exuded the smell of offerings day and night. Resources from the royal treasury were diverted to feed foreign priests, to purchase animals for sacrifice, and to erect columns and statues dedicated to the god who promised fertility and prosperity. It was then that Jezebel showed her true colors. She was not interested in coexisting peacefully with the worship of the God of Israel. No, for Jezebel, two gods could not occupy the same throne. The Lord would have to be silenced for Baal to reign. This spiritual conflict began to corrode Israel from within. As the people were divided between ancient traditions and the seduction of the new temples, Jezebel consolidated her influence. She was not just a queen consort, she was a missionary of idolatry, determined to rewrite the identity of an entire people. And with every step, with every decision, Jezebel made Ahab even more dependent on her. He, the king, seemed a mere supporting character. She, the foreigner, was the one who truly ruled the kingdom. The throne was named after Ahab, but the power was in Jezebel's hands. This reversal shocked not only the Lord's prophets, but also the surrounding peoples. Israel, once known as the people of the one God, now harbored temples of Baal, strange chants and rituals that stained the land with blood. Jezebel not only imported her faith, she exported her arrogance. Imagine the simple Israelites, accustomed to praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now watching helplessly as foreign altars rose up in the heart of their capital. The shock was cultural, spiritual, and moral. Jezebel was not just a foreign queen. She was an intruder who wanted to reprogram the faith of an entire people. And in this scenario of growing tension, the stage was set for one of the greatest confrontations in history. Jezebel, the woman who dared to manipulate kings and defy the very God of Israel, against the prophets who would not remain silent. The political marriage that was supposed to bring peace between kingdoms actually sowed the seeds of the most ferocious spiritual war ever recorded. Jezebel had arrived, and with her, not only gold and seduction, but the shadow of idolatry that would forever change Israel's destiny. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in Ahab's shoes, would you accept an alliance that would bring you power and wealth, but at the cost of losing your faith and tradition? Write in the comments below what your choice would be in this dilemma. Jezebel's arrival in Israel was not just an episode of political unity, it was the beginning of an unprecedented cultural and spiritual battle. Until then, Israel had established its identity in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with prophets, religious festivals, and commandments that shaped the people's lives. But Jezebel brought with her something much deeper than diplomatic alliances. She brought Baal, and with him a worldview that shocked, seduced, and corrupted. Baal, the god of storms, fertility, and prosperity, represented the source of life and wealth for the Phoenicians. His worship was linked to exuberant rituals, frenetic dances, sacrifices, and even sexual practices in temples. It was a religion that stirred the senses, promising abundant harvests and immediate pleasure. In contrast, the God of Israel demanded fidelity, purity, justice, and obedience to commandments invisible to the fleshly eye, but which sustained the spirit and morals of a people. This contrast could not be more evident. On one side, the quiet discipline of the Israelite faith, with simple sacrifices and commandments regulating everything from food to personal relationships. On the other, the sensual and extravagant explosion of Baal's rituals, which blended luxury, gold, wine, music, and ecstatic bodies. Jezebel understood well the power of seduction and used religion as a political weapon to win hearts and minds. Imagine the scene, altars to Baal being erected in the heart of Samaria, Phoenician priests chanting, the scent of incense filling the air while stunned Israelites watched, torn between ancient tradition and the allure of the new. For many, it was irresistible. After all, Baal seemed to promise material prosperity, while the God of Israel demanded faith in the midst of drought, renunciation amid temptations. But Jezebel didn't just want coexistence. There was no room for two gods. She wanted to replace the Lord of Israel, and to that end, she began persecuting the prophets. Men who once spoke in God's name were hunted down, silenced, and forced to hide in caves. The blood of the Most High's servants began to stain the land, while temples of Baal multiplied before the people's helpless eyes. This persecution was not only religious, it was also symbolic. Jezebel wanted to prove that Baal was stronger than the God of Israel, that her foreign culture was superior to the traditions of that people. Every altar erected was an affront. Every priest killed was a message. In my kingdom, there is only room for Baal. Little by little, Israel's identity began to erode. Families were divided, young people were drawn to seductive rituals, and crops were dedicated to a foreign god. The clash of cultures became a spiritual abyss, but behind this apparent victory lay something Jezebel could not control: the God of Israel himself. When the heavens closed and the drought extended, it was as if the Lord cried out to that nation, "It is not Baal who controls the rain, but I." The climatic and spiritual crisis became the stage for a revelation Jezebel refused to acknowledge. It was an invisible but devastating conflict. It wasn't just a struggle between two gods, but between two worldviews. On one side, fidelity and truth; on the other, desire and illusion. And on this battlefield, Jezebel believed she was winning. The people, however, were beginning to feel the weight of doubt. Baal's promises were unfulfilled, the sky remained bronze, and Elijah's God loomed large as a silent but indestructible presence. The clash of cultures intensified, paving the way for a confrontation that would forever mark Israel's history. Ahab's throne was stained with idolatry, but God's eyes were upon the nation. Jezebel might have power, wealth, and the allure of the masses, but a greater battle was just beginning. The clash between Baal and the Lord would not end in silence. With Jezebel's ascension to the throne of Israel, it was not enough to build temples to Baal or enthrone Phoenician priests in the heart of the kingdom. The true objective was to silence the voices that dared to proclaim the name of the God of Israel. Jezebel brooked no resistance, and the presence of the prophets represented a constant reminder that her power was not absolute. It was like a bothersome shadow cast over her golden glory, and for her the solution was simple: extermination. Biblical accounts and traditions describe relentless persecution. Prophets were hunted like criminals, dragged before hired judges, and summarily sentenced to death. Entire families were torn apart. Men who dared speak out were silenced forever. Jezebel didn't just want to eliminate individuals, she wanted to erase the memory of the God of Israel from the people's daily lives. Imagine the scene: soldiers marching through the narrow streets of Samaria, dragging simple men from their homes. Children wailed, wives begged for mercy, as guards dragged their husbands out on charges of blasphemy. Altars to Baal glowed in the night's fire, while the bodies of God's servants disappeared into the silence of dawn. The kingdom, which should have been guided by justice and compassion, was drenched in innocent blood. But amid this darkness, pockets of resistance emerged. The prophet Obadiah, a man of silent faith, risked his life every day to hide God's servants. 100 prophets were saved by his courage, divided into groups, and taken to damp, cold caves, where they survived on nothing but bread and water. There, hidden from the queen's wrath, they kept the flame of hope alive, praying in secret, waiting for the day when God's justice would be revealed. For Jezebel, this wasn't just politics. It was spiritual warfare. She knew that as long as there were prophets, there would be resistance. Therefore, she intensified her persecution with increasingly cruel methods. Human sacrifices in honor of Baal were described as part of the darkest rituals. The blood spilled on the altars was mixed with that of the murdered prophets, as if the queen wanted to prove that even devotion could be used as a weapon of power. The people, increasingly divided, found themselves in a deadly dilemma. Many gave in to fear, bending their knees before Baal to save their lives. Others in silence maintained their faith in the Lord, praying in secret, hiding their scrolls of the law, passing their hope from generation to generation. The kingdom was divided not only between kings and queens, but between the fear of death and fidelity to God. And as the blood of the righteous flowed, Jezebel grew ever more arrogant. She strode through the palace with a firm stride, her Phoenician linen garments covered in glittering jewels, exuding the certainty that no man, no prophet would dare stand against her. Even Ahab the king bowed before her authority, unable to resist her implacable determination. But heaven, though silent, was not indifferent. Every silenced voice, every life taken, every tear shed echoed before God. The apparent silence was only the prelude to an answer that would change history, because Jezebel believed she had won. She believed Baal reigned supreme in Israel, but the true God was still there, watching, waiting for the right moment to intervene. And when that moment came, the bloodshed would become an irresistible clamor that no one could ignore. The contrast was stark. Jezebel, at her banquets and celebrations, toasting with wine, while the prophets lay dying in dark caves. The light from Baal's altars seemed to dominate the night, but in the hearts of those who still resisted, there was a flame that could not be extinguished. This was the reality of Israel under Jezebel, a kingdom divided between fear and faith, between idolatry and truth. And in the midst of this bloody scenario, God would raise up one who would not bow, one who would confront the queen and her army of priests. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would not only be between men and gods, but between human arrogance and divine justice. The kingdom was plunged into spiritual silence. For years, drought had ravaged Israel, and the once fertile fields had turned to dust, scattered by the wind like ash. The people cried out. The priests of Baal shouted day and night, but the heavens remained closed. It was as if the heavens were mocking the Phoenician gods. It was then that God raised Elijah to a confrontation that would change the history not only of Israel, but of the entire ancient world. Mount Carmel, one of the most imposing sites in the region, would become the stage for a duel between the true God and the false. Imagine the scene. Thousands of Israelites gathered around a sacred plain, waiting to see which deity would respond. On one side, 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophetesses of Asherah, dressed in colorful robes, chanting and beating drums in a ritualistic frenzy. On the other side, Elijah stood alone, a simple-looking man dressed in rough skins, but carrying the authority of God in every word. The silence of the people was broken by the prophet's firm voice. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. The words echoed like thunder in the hearts of the crowd, exposing their indecision, their fragmented faith. The challenge was set. 2 altars would be erected, 2 sacrifices prepared, but the fire would not be lit by human hands. The true God would manifest himself by fire descending from heaven. For the prophets of Baal, it was a chance to prove their divinity was real. For Elijah, it was an opportunity to reveal the glory of the Lord. The first part of the spectacle began with Baal. The priests danced in circles, cut their own bodies with knives in blood rituals, and cried out in shrill voices trying to summon their God. The day wore on. The sun burned overhead, and nothing happened. No sound, no fire, no sign. Elijah, in his boldness, mocked. "Shout louder. Perhaps Baal is asleep or traveling." The people, previously divided, began to realize the emptiness of Jezebel's promises. Then it was Elijah's turn. Without shouting, without frenzy, just with faith, he rebuilt the altar of the Lord with 12 stones, representing the tribes of Israel. As a reminder of the broken covenant, he placed the wood, prepared the sacrifice, and, in an act that defied all human logic, ordered the altar to be doused with water. 3 times they poured jars of water until the water ran down, forming a ditch around it. The sacrifice was so wet that, to human eyes, it was impossible to set it ablaze. Then Elijah raised his voice to heaven. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant." The impossible happened. Fire fell from the sky, blazing, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the flowing water. It was so intense that the ground shook, and the crowd fell to their knees, shouting, "The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God." Baal's power had been unmasked. The people, once divided, now bowed before the true God. Elijah ordered the false prophets captured, and the valley witnessed the execution of those who had deceived. The people fueled idolatry and sustained Jezebel's power. But this triumph did not end the story, for the news reached Jezebel, and her fury was like a wildfire about to consume everything around her. The duel on Carmel was a resounding victory for God, but also the beginning of an even more relentless persecution. Jezebel vowed to kill Elijah, and the prophet, despite his glory, would become the target of the mortal hatred of the most cruel woman in biblical history. This confrontation wasn't just about gods, but about authority, about who truly ruled Israel. It was an eternal reminder that divine fire can fall on any altar, consuming all that opposes the truth. And here's the question that sticks in my mind. If you witnessed fire descending from heaven on Mount Carmel, would you have the courage to abandon everything and follow this God, or would you still be skeptical? Comment below with your honest reaction. The victory at Mount Carmel ignited Israel's faith, but it also ignited an even hotter fury in Jezebel's heart. When news reached the palace, describing how the prophets of Baal had been defeated, captured, and killed before the people, the queen felt no fear. She felt hatred, a cold, calculated hatred that burned hotter than the desert sun itself. Jezebel was not just an offended queen, she was an outraged priestess of Baal, a woman who saw her spiritual empire crumble before her eyes. As Elijah prostrated himself in prayer and watched the rain finally descend upon the parched earth, Jezebel plotted the destruction of the one who had dared to defy her. Her fury was proclaimed in words that echoed through the palace corridors. "May the gods deal severely with me if Elijah is still alive by this time tomorrow." It was more than a threat. It was a death sentence. Imagine the weight of those words. Jezebel held absolute power. Guards, armies, priests, all under her command. Elijah, who had single-handedly faced hundreds of prophets, now found himself hunted, like a criminal marked for death. The prophet who had defied multitudes trembled before the relentless pursuit of a woman who seemed to know no bounds. Elijah fled into the desert. Each step on the dry sand echoed the memory of the fire that had fallen from the sky, but also the fear of approaching vengeance. He ran, exhausted, until he collapsed under a stunted tree, begging God to take his life. The man who had defied kings now felt small before the fury of a queen. This is the depth of spiritual warfare. Victory does not eliminate fear, it only reveals where faith needs to be renewed. While Elijah sought refuge, Jezebel reinforced her image among the people. She ordered new sacrifices, restored altars, and proclaimed that Baal had not been defeated, but merely tested. She used fear-mongering to stifle any spark of faith in the God of Israel. The few who believed in the Lord were forced to hide, living like shadows in caves, sustained by secret courage. But there's a powerful detail. Jezebel had armies, but Elijah had something she could never control, the presence of the living God. And it was in this flight, in desperation, that Elijah found not only protection, but also renewal. In the caves of Horeb, he heard the voice of the Lord, not in the wind, nor in the fire, nor in the earthquake, but in a gentle whisper. A reminder that God's power doesn't need spectacles to be real. Meanwhile, Jezebel continued to rule as if nothing could touch her. Her makeup, luxurious, clothes and defiant posture, conveyed the image of an untouchable woman. But behind the mask, an inevitable fate loomed. Because even though Elijah was on the run, the prophecy of his downfall had already been unleashed. This contrast between the queen's arrogance and the prophet's vulnerability reveals something profound. True power lies not in palaces, armies, or threats, but in the invisible hand that moves history. Jezebel believed she controlled the future, but she was already moving toward the fulfillment of her own prophecy. Her hatred of Elijah wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. It represented the clash between two kingdoms, the kingdom of idolatry sustained by blood, and the kingdom of a God who reveals himself in silence. This hunt against Elijah was more than persecution. It was the beginning of Jezebel's end, because every time someone raises their hand against the truth, they are, without realizing it, signing their own sentence. After the drought and the battle, on Mount Carmel, the kingdom still bore the scars of the confrontation between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. But Jezebel, relentless in her quest for power, was far from admitting defeat. And it is in this context that one of the most disturbing stories in the entire Bible emerges, the story of Naboth, the simple man who dared to say no to a king and paid with his life. Ahab, Jezebel's husband, possessed lands, palaces, and riches. But the human heart, when corrupted, is never satisfied. Near the royal palace was a modest vineyard, cultivated by Naboth, an inheritance from his parents. It was an ordinary piece of land, but laden with memory, sweat, and dignity. Ahab desired that vineyard. He approached Naboth and offered money or other property in exchange, but Naboth refused, not out of rebellion, but out of fidelity to the traditions of Israel. The inheritance of my fathers is not for sale. For Ahab, this was a blow. The king returned to the palace with his head down, like a frustrated child, unable to accept a common man's refusal. And it was at this moment that Jezebel entered the scene. Seeing her husband dejected, she mocked his weakness. Is this how the king of Israel rules? Arise, eat, and be merry. I will give you Naboth's vineyard. These words were not just a promise, they were a sentence. Jezebel took it upon herself to eliminate any obstacle to her desires. With cold cunning, she devised a macabre plan. She wrote letters in the king's name, sealed with the royal ring, ordering that Naboth be accused of blasphemy against God and the throne. 2 false witnesses were paid to confirm the lie. It was a rigged trial with no right to defense. Naboth was convicted and stoning to death. The blood of an innocent man stained the streets of Israel, while Jezebel smiled. The next day, Jezebel handed the vineyard to Ahab as if it were a trivial gift, ignoring the spiritual weight of that crime. To her, it was just another act of power, further proof that no one could resist her will, but before God that blood would not be forgotten. Naboth's cry pierced the heavens and brought with it the voice of justice. Elijah was sent back to the palace. Imagine the scene, the prophet, still scarred by persecution, walking with firm steps to the place where Ahab now possessed the stolen vineyard. The air was heavy, the guards tense, the silence heavy. Then Elijah's voice broke like thunder. In the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, there they will lick your blood also, O king. And as for Jezebel, dogs will devour her flesh by the wall of Jezreel. These words were not just prophecy. They were a sentence recorded before heaven and earth. Jezebel, in her arrogance, ignored them. She laughed at the prophecy as one who despises the wind. But the invisible thread of justice had already been cast, and her downfall was only a matter of time. The Naboth episode reveals the queen's darkest side. Until then, her cruelty seemed directed against prophets and the worship of the God of Israel. But now she touched the life of a simple, hard-working man who posed no threat. Jezebel didn't just kill a prophet or an opponent. She destroyed a common citizen, proving that her thirst for power knew no bounds. This story echoes as a warning to this day. When injustice is institutionalized, when lies become law, and power rises above truth, a nation's fate is already sealed. Naboth died a victim, but his death exposed the rot that consumed Israel's throne. While Jezebel celebrated, heaven wrote her condemnation. For no manipulation, no false testimony, no political alliance can silence the voice of divine justice. Naboth's blood still cried out from the earth, and that cry would be answered. I want to hear your opinion. If someone looked you in the eye and prophesied about your future, would you take it as a divine warning or just a human threat? Write here how you would react in that moment. The years passed. Jezebel still reigned from the shadows even after Ahab's death. Her sons ascended the throne, but everyone knew the one who truly ruled was the Queen Mother. She didn't need the crown to wield power. Her gaze, her words, and her manipulation were enough to keep Israel under her sway. But the harvest time had arrived. Elijah's prophecy, spoken before Naboth's blood-stained vineyard, still echoed in the air. Dogs would devour the queen's flesh in the field of Jezreel. It was into this scenario that Jehu emerged, a military commander, a man of war hardened by blood and battle. He was not just a general. He had been anointed to execute divine justice, rise up against the house of Ahab, and put an end to Jezebel's reign. When Jehu marched with his soldiers toward Jezreel, the city trembled. The people were already murmuring. The terror that had once sustained the queen's power was beginning to dissipate like smoke. Jezebel, however, was not one to hide. In the darkest moment of her life, she chose the path of defiance. Knowing that Jehu was at the gates, she painted herself as a queen going to a banquet, arranged her hair, and positioned herself at the palace window. It was her final act of sovereignty. She wanted to face death the same way she had lived, haughty, arrogant, convinced that she could intimidate even God's judgment with her presence. When Jehu passed through the gates, there she was, staring down at him with the expression of someone who still believed herself untouchable. Her voice echoed with contempt. "How are you, murderer of your master?" It wasn't a plea for mercy, it was a provocation. It was an attempt to reverse, with words, what the sword had already decided. But Jehu was unmoved. She looked up, looked at the servants who accompanied her and asked, "Who is with me?" Silence fell for a moment. Then 2 or 3 eunuchs, servants who had once feared Jezebel, turned against her. The queen's power had been broken. The fear that had kept those men loyal had vanished. They no longer saw Jezebel as a queen, but as a condemned woman. "Throw her," Jehu ordered, and that's what happened. Jezebel's body fell from the window. The impact with the floor was brutal. Blood spattered the walls and the horses, which, without hesitation, trampled her under the new king's orders. The body that had once adorned itself with jewels, perfumes, and luxurious clothing now lay shattered in the dust of Jezreel. Jehu, impassive, entered the palace. He sat down to eat and drink as if nothing had happened. Then he gave a cold order, "Bury her, for she is a king's daughter." But when they went to retrieve the body, they found only the skull, the feet, and the palms of the hands. The dogs had devoured the rest, just as Elijah had prophesied years before. There was no longer any doubt. The prophecy had been fulfilled in every detail. Jezebel's fate was not just death, but shame. She would have no honorable burial, no preserved memory, no mourning. Her flesh became food for dogs, and her remains dung in the fields. No one could point to a tomb and say, "Here lies Jezebel." The seemingly eternal queen dissolved into the earth as if she had never existed. This end was not just the end of a powerful woman's life. It was proof that no manipulation can silence the voice of divine justice. Jezebel, who controlled kings, killed prophets, and made idolatry law, now became an eternal example of what happens when human power attempts to challenge the power of heaven. Naboth's blood cried out. Elijah's voice echoed. And on the ground of Jezreel, shrouded in silence and the smell of death, history recorded. Pride and idolatry always lead to ruin. Jezebel, the queen who seduced, manipulated, and reigned without limits, was now a memory of dust, shame, and judgment. Now tell me, if you were inside the walls of Jezreel the day Jehu arrived, would you stand by Jezebel out of loyalty, or would you switch sides to save your own life? Leave your choice in the comments below. Jezebel's fall wasn't just the end of a woman, it was the end of an entire system that had defied the living God. Her brutal death, devoured by dogs in the fields of Jezreel, not only erased her life, but also left a deep scar on humanity's collective memory. Therefore, the name Jezebel has never disappeared. It has become synonymous with idolatry, manipulation, seduction, and arrogance. She's not just an ancient figure, she's an eternal symbol. Throughout the centuries, prophets, kings, and even Christ himself cited Jezebel as an example of what corrupts hearts and entire societies. In the book of Revelation, her name appears as a warning to a church that tolerated false teachings. Jezebel went from being merely a queen of Phoenicia to becoming an archetype of rebellion against God, a living reminder that no human power can silence the truth. But her dark legacy isn't just in the pages of the Bible. It's also reflected in the structures of our own time, because every time power is used to manipulate, every time seduction is wielded as a weapon, every time injustice is imposed on the lives of the innocent, the spirit of Jezebel is revived. It's no coincidence that her story continues to resonate. She's a mirror, a reminder that even amid luxury, glory, and human achievement, pride always paves the way for downfall. Jezebel's trajectory shows us that true power lies not in the crown, in riches, nor in controlling the masses. True power lies in submitting to the laws that govern the universe, in recognizing that there is a limit beyond which human pride cannot cross. Jezebel believed she could erase that limit, and so she ended up as an eternal warning. Her banquets disappeared, her altars were destroyed, her riches turned to dust, and even her body was devoured by dogs. In the end, nothing remained of her except the warning, a warning etched in blood and dust. No throne is indestructible, no queen is eternal, no empire can stand when it rises against the living God. Look closely at this story. It's not just about Israel's distant past, it's about us. How often do our societies build their own altars to modern gods? Money, vanity, power, pleasure, and like Jezebel, believe nothing can topple them. How often do leaders use their position not to serve but to crush? How often do we forget that arrogance always paves the way for ruin? Jezebel is a portrait of humanity when it loses its sense of limits, and her fall is a reminder that justice may be delayed, but it never fails. The same God who heard Naboth's cry, who raised Elijah against an empire, who did not remain silent in the face of idolatry, remains the same. Jezebel believed she could live above any law, but she discovered in the cruelest way that no one is above divine judgment. Therefore, her story spans the centuries not as a legend, but as a warning. When pride blinds, when seduction dominates, when power corrupts, the end is always the same: dust, silence, and shame. Jezebel is remembered not for the glory of her palaces, but for the sound of dogs devouring her flesh, a symbol of a fate no amount of wealth can avert. And here's the echo that reaches us today. Have we learned from Jezebel, or are we simply repeating her mistakes on a larger scale? Her legacy is more than an ancient narrative. It's a mirror held up to humanity, and each generation must decide, will it heed the warning, or will it ignore it until judgment falls again? If this story touched you, don't let it pass you by. Support it with a like and subscribe to the channel now, because there are still many hidden revelations waiting to be told. And don't stop here. The next video is already appearing on your screen. Click it and continue this journey with me. Every detail can completely change the way you see the past and the present.